Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz. Welcome, everyone, to our next and newest installment of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. We are your hosts. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Azaii Muniz, second-year medical student here in Boston. I'm very excited for today's topic with my fantastic co-host,
Phil Hawkins, the MCAT director at Jack Westin, as well as a person who's been in med school. Today we're talking about psych soc, which if you had talked to me about 4 years ago, my advice would be completely different. The psych soc is the newest portion of the MCAT, which at this point is like 6 years old, but so it's in kindergarten at this point, but it's still relatively new compared to the other sections of the MCAT. And that has made some very interesting things that's caused some very interesting things in how psych soc is taught. And I personally was not all that great at teaching psych soc when I started. And I know that most test prep companies were kind of the same because how the MCAT tested psych soc is different than how it tests other sections of the test. And so today we're going to talk about this section and how to work on this. And the way that I want to talk about this is with a story, which is kind of interesting for a couple of reasons, as we'll see down the line. But I had a student several years ago, I think it's almost 4 years ago now. Now I feel really old, who came to me. She was in a program where she was going to get automatic acceptance into med school if she could get like a 127 in each section of the MCAT. And she was doing really well in most of the sections. She was getting like a 128, 129 in every section except for psych, where she was getting a 124. And so what I did, when I met with her and she's like, okay, I just need to raise my score in psych. I've got a month. I just need to pull it up a couple of points. And so I did things a little bit different with her because we were just doing psych and not worried about anything else. And so I'm going to talk about how we did this, but the results where she ended up getting a perfect score in psych. It went from her lowest section by multiple points to her highest section by multiple points. So in 1 month, she went from a 124 to a 132. And so that completely changed how I teach psych. Because since then, I have done the same strategy with lots of students. About 20% of my students are getting perfect scores in psych. And the other ones are still 131s, 130s. And mostly just if a student can go through this, then through this process of dealing with psych, then when they come out the other end, they're just going to do really well in psych. And so this actually is why in the Jack Westin science course or complete course, we teach psych completely different than every other test prep company. I'm sure of that. And we teach it different than how I used to teach it 5 years ago. And it's because it's based on this, the results that I've had with the students. And so that's the scientist, the PhD in me coming out, where it's data driven, right? My data shows this works. So let's do this. But long story short, so I've kind of explained the scenario. Let's talk about how actually that process works. So the AMC has an outline where they give you a list of topics, they break it into sections, and section 1, 2, and 3 are all bio, 4 and 5 are chemistry and physics. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are psychology and sociology. So they basically give you a breakdown of the different topics that they're going to hold you accountable for. They're going to expect you to know certain things like magnetism or amino acids. But in the psych soc section, they get a little bit more detailed and they kind of give you lots of different terms. I feel the outline isn't as useful for chemistry and physics because it's you need to know magnetism. And you're I know, but at what level, how deep, what equations, it kind of doesn't explain it that well. But the psych soc, the way psych is tested, it's kind of a vocab focused exam, but I want to be careful calling it that because a lot of times students will try to memorize definitions. And the way that I worked through the course, the way I worked through it with this one student and how I've worked through it with hundreds of students at this point is we go through the outline and each term, it's sensation, thresholds, signal detection theory, Weber's law. I actually think those are the first 4 on the list, which is just coming from my memory, which shows that I do this too often. But the way that we did it is I had each student give me their own example. Like I wanted them to tell me a story about how, like, what's going on with sensation and how that's different from perception, and like how they would tell the difference. And that does two things. First off, students are more likely to remember stories, which is why I said it was kind of funny I was starting off with a story, because like you guys are going to remember that story about like the student who really increased their score, because stories just stick. Like that's like an easier thing to remember. I know that's our very first podcast was about this, and like my research with memory and my PhD, and like stories are just better ways to remember something. So first off, doing it this way, where you come up with a story and example for every single vocab term, is a better way to learn it long term. Secondly, that's how the MCAT is going to test it. They are never going to ask you for a definition. That's not how the exam works. They're going to ask you like, Bill lives in a cabin and he goes to town often, but he avoids socializing because he doesn't see the need for socialization. What kind of personality disorder does he have? The answer there is schizoid, by the way, not avoidant or antisocial, which is probably what most students would pick, but avoidant, or I'm sorry, schizoid was the answer to that one. And so if you are learning these things with stories, it's a whole lot easier to remember than just like definitions of like, what is schizoid personality? What's antisocial? What's avoidant? What's dependent? Or the other 6 different personality disorders, which you do need to know. And so like having stories is just a better way to learn it. It sticks with you longer, and it's how the MCAT is going to test you. So if you're already thinking about it in those ways, it works better. I feel like I have to like hold myself back from just like talking for 2 hours about psych soc, because it's a really interesting section that I feel like I only recently, in the last like 4 years, like really mastered how to help students increase their score.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the sections, and this is my experience. I have not had a student who exclusively wants to work on psych soc. So I think that's a great learning opportunity. And I think it's amazing that all of this came from that, because it just goes to show that the way that most of us approached, and past tense because when we were studying, is not necessarily the best way, right? And so I think I've mentioned this ad nauseum at this point. I'm not someone who can sit down and do flashcards and just memorize. And so when I started realizing that that's not the only way to go about the psych soc section, I was personally really happy. And so something that when I do work on psych soc with students, or when I have worked on psych soc with students, what I've done is I've worked through examples. So I've said, okay, you're having difficulty with the different types of learning, with the schedules of, the reinforcement schedules. Let's sit down. Let's just have a story time, right? And so walk through, you have a 5-year-old child, right? And you're trying to get them to perform a certain type of certain behavior. What would rationally work and what would not produce very good results. And so sometimes, we like to think that, okay, I just need to study more for psych soc. I just need to spend more time. We throw it to the side. But it's also how you spend that time. And hopefully that's a theme that you've heard throughout our podcasts. It's not just brute forcing your way through the MCAT. That is not the best way to spend your time. That is not the best way to spend your mental and emotional bandwidth. So, those stories have something that is super salient and that you're going to remember on test day, because you can also come up with these elaborate stories that then you don't remember. And that's not quite as helpful, right? So I don't, the first story that you gave us, Phil, with the friends who got married, and then that was whatever example you created, that was the Wi-Fi password, right? Yeah. That's something super meaningful to Phil, but unfortunately I don't remember it, right? So it's a great story. And I that's something that I'm sure you will remember to your deathbed.
Right.
But it's
Pickle,
also
zebra, Mary Perch, sadness ever lap. For those of you looking for a call back on that.
See, he knew exactly what I was talking about without me knowing what the topic or remembering the topic. But the idea is that if you find, right, a story that makes sense to you, or you work through an example that makes sense to you, that's the most important. So I just wanted to make sure that we say that, just because everyone does have like a slightly different lean, what they remember better, in terms of just like you went, and also when you create it yourself, you remember it, so that's another huge thing. So don't just read a list of examples that you've seen online. Try and struggle a little bit yourself, that as much as it's uncomfortable to struggle, especially in a section that feels like I can just memorize my way through it, it can actually be really helpful to have a little bit of difficulty and then work a little bit harder so that you remember the information on test day.
Yeah, you're more likely to remember an example of a psychological disorder if your reference is my Uncle Steve, right? Like that's way easier for you to remember than maybe somebody else hasn't did this and like they have some celebrity on a TV show that they watch that you don't watch. Like that's not as meaningful to you. Speaking of which, like other people's references, I know a lot of people are familiar with the 300 page or 80 page like psych outline. What we're talking about, that's what this is. Only you should create your own. Go through and like make your own examples of each of those. And this is by far the best way to deal with psych soc. I think it's better to make your own examples than it is to use somebody else's. Like you don't remember like stories that you've read in a book nearly as well as you remember stories of things that happened to you. And so when you can like take things and make them a little bit more personal, they stick with you better because we're all selfish on the inside. Egocentrism, that's a psych vocab term. But that's a really important thing. And maybe we've kind of jumped the gun here because we've talked a lot about like how you should study psych soc, but I want to kind of take a second here and show why we should study psych soc, because a lot of students don't put in as much effort on the psych section as they do on physics or orgo or like chemistry or any of those. And that they're doing themselves a disservice by doing that. Psych is, first off, it's kind of like after cars and the biochem stuff, which I lump together, psych is the highest yield. And then the next two highest yield after that would be chemistry and sociology. Like you actually have as many psych questions as the next two, chemistry and sociology together. You actually have more psych questions than physics and chemistry combined. And students spend way more time studying chemistry and physics than they do psych. But you should, like, just based on the number of questions that you're doing, you should be spending more time on psych than biology and chemistry combined. And that's just if you're studying based purely on the number of questions you're going to see. And nobody does that. And that's a problem. Like students tend to neglect psych and not pay much attention to it. And that in and of itself is another reason to study psych, because your peers are not studying psych as much as they should. And because of how the MCAT is scored, you are curved against how everyone else does. And so if you put in a good chunk of time on psych and your peers are all kind of ignoring it, it's a good way to increase your score quicker than if you're studying something like you have to study a bunch just to keep up with where everyone else is. So I actually think that when it comes to bang for your buck in terms of time commitment, like psych soc is probably one of the best ways to do it. And students really, really underestimate the amount of time going in on the psych soc. There's a student, I just met with him earlier this week, who is taking her exam in 4 weeks. And so it's like not very long before exam day. And she was like wondering if she could do some tutoring stuff. And like, as I looked at it, I'm like, okay, we don't have much time. So we're going to focus on cars, bio, and psych soc. So cars, bio, and psych, just forgetting sociology, just cars, bio, and psych. Those three sections are 2/3 of the exam. Like sociology, physics, chemistry, organic chemistry, all those 4 sections are less than 1/3 of the exam. And so if there's I just want to drive home how important it is to spend time on psych, because psych is very high yield and you can get a good increase on your score. And like, if you've got a good methodology, like this is, I don't want to say like it's a guaranteed way, but every student I've done this with has had their psych score go up like significantly, just by kind of like going through the steps of like making up stories, which is kind of fun to do anyway. And it feels good as you're like going through to like cross off these terms. And so it's really easy to see your progress. Generally, students are a little bit more motivated and they can keep their motivation up higher. They don't burn out as quickly. And so I think it's just a good like thing to do if you have the time to spend a good chunk of effort dealing with the psych section. That being said, students don't put in as much effort in there as they should. We do our free trial sessions, and like the psych ones are always way lower attendance. So even though like physics, you're going to have about, I think it's 15 questions in physics versus 38 psychology questions on test day. like still I get way more students coming to the physics free trial sessions than the psych ones. And like don't get me wrong, I love physics and physics is fun and awesome, but it's not as high yield as psych is.
Yeah, different ways of saying similar ideas. I've had students, and I just want to say this explicitly because sometimes we say, oh, well, that's not quite me, right? Saying, oh, well, I do spend some time on psych soc, right? So I don't really need to spend much more. Like I'm in an okay place. But like Phil is saying, if this is the section where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, right? Mm-hmm. If you're at an okay place, why not do a little bit of extra work and get at a really great place, bring your cumulative score up, right? And then along the way, not just with the crossing things out, but it's kind of like you mentioned, fun to do these, to make up stories and just kind of have like story time with your friends, your family, whoever it is, whoever, you can talk to or talk at while you're studying. But it's also a huge way to boost morale, right? And just maintain that general motivation. So even if, you're struggling through a chem topic that week, right? You're like, okay, well, I made it through psych. So I'm still making general progress, right? I'm still doing really well. I'm at where I need to be. You might even be able to get ahead and then feel really great. It's also an area that you can be more flexible with. So when, you have, let's say you're a student, right? You're still actively in undergrad right now while you're studying for the MCAT, and you have a week with midterms, and then maybe your school that has like their courses can scatter their midterms. And so one week is a little bit more hectic than the other. And so we had talked about when we talked about creating study plans, right? Allowing for some flexibility each week and coming, taking things as they come along. Psych Soc is a great place where you can add, if you have a little bit of extra time, you can add a little bit more Psych Soc, right? Without necessarily feeling you're taking a lot of mental energy away from your courses, or vice versa, right? It's a section where maybe you really need to, you're still struggling with bio topic, right? And so you wanted to, the word in English is failing me, devote a little bit more time to the bio topic, right? Maybe you compare back on Psych Soc, but the thing is you're still making general progress. And so Psych Soc, in my opinion, is one of those topics where you can adjust how much you're putting into it on a more regular basis to buffer some of life's inevitables. And so, you're basically reasons to study psych, right? Higher yield, you're just by chance going to see more of it on test day. It's actually more fun to study. Sorry, Phil, I'm maybe I'm not as interested in physics as you are. And the bio person me is a little bit more drawn to that. But there are actually a lot of benefits to it. And so I can't tell you the number of times I've had students when, we were tutoring say, I don't want to talk about Psych Soc. Well, that score hasn't changed in the last 2 months of studying. So why don't we sit down and talk about Psych Soc, right? So it doesn't get a lot of love, but it needs a lot more love. And then also you can reason your way through quite a bit. And so if all else fails, right, on test day, this is the one section where even if you don't have a good reference, you can still say, okay, well, this is really similar to stuff that I am familiar with. And I know that this is completely off topic for this question. And so I can get rid of it, right? Or this term looks nothing like the terms that I know are related to this topic. So something's a little funky here, right? So that's a last resort kind of situation. Please do not go into Psych Soc without having studied at all. But it's a section that's more amenable to that versus if you saw, a chem phys and you just have a list of numbers and you don't know what calculation to even look at, you really don't have, a good reference point for narrowing down. Whereas with Psych Soc, you can.
Yeah, there's something really interesting about Psych Soc. Like once you get a really good grip on just the vocab, which is challenging because there's a lot of stuff in there, but like having stories makes it so much easier. If you just can say like social interactionism is a theory on why we develop language. And so if they have a question on money's questionable value on a deserted island implies that money is what kind of thing? And then you have an answer that's like a social construct. And then you have social interactionism. Like social interactionism is about language. It has nothing to do with money on an island. So social construct is the answer. And that's something that, like, once you know the term, it's so easy of a question, but like, you have to know the term going in. Like you have to know what those things are. And like I said, a lot of them sound similar. You have like social interactionism, social constructionism, and symbolic interactionism. And those are three completely different topics. One's like about society giving something value because of society. One's why we develop language, because we want to chat with people. And one's like the difference between bowing in one country versus another country, and as a way to like communicate. And like those are all slightly different things, but the words are all kind of similar. Or like schizophrenia, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Those all sound the same. But if you think like, oh, schizotypal, that's Yoda, because he like talks weird and like has a strange magical thing going on. And you're like, oh, the way I remember that is because schizotypal has a Y in it for Yoda. And so like, that's how I remember this, because I've got like a story. And then schizoid wants to avoid people. Like that's the guy that we talked about earlier that lived in a cabin and just didn't feel like talking to people because it like they just didn't have the drive for social interactions. And that's like, once you have a story and it's like Yoda, yeah, like there you go. I got something like that's so easy to remember once you've got like that sort of connection. And so that sticks with you, and that's interesting. And that takes this question and turns it into something that's a lot easier. As you are doing psych soc, because it's very vocab focused, it's not definition focused, but it is still vocab focused because you have to apply the vocab. You need to make sure that as you're reviewing, and like if you got a question right, because it was something about somebody who speaks and strangely and has magical thinking, and you're like, that's Yoda, right? And like, so, it's schizotypal. You need to look at the other answer choices and make sure you know what those are about. Because on test day, you have kind of like 2 shots at every single question. You can know the right answer or know the 3 wrong answers. And either way, like you get the point. And all the answers in the psych soc section, all the wrong answers are correct answers to other questions. And so if you can go through like an exam, like the psych soc stuff, and like make sure you know what every single like answer is talking about, then you're in a really good position. And so it is this kind of like weird thing. Like, as we mentioned, like students don't put in much time on it, but you get like way more bang for your buck in terms of timing. And to talk about like that adaptability, you can't like if you're standing in line at like the DMV for 10 minutes, you can't learn magnetism, but you could learn what is functionalism, right? Or like what is the id, the ego, and the superego, right? What is Piaget's stages? Like you can work for like 10 minutes or 5 minutes on psych soc and make progress, which is not something you can always do in all the other sections. And so I actually think that that's a really, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over. It's so high yield. Put some time in on this. I do want to point out in the course that we do, I have students create their own version of this outline with their own examples. And then we just talk through it. And we like talk through every single term and just like discuss each one. I tell stories and give examples and things like that. And that's how the course is designed, which is based off of this strategy that I know works really well in the way that it is prepared.
A few quick kind of practicals, right? Putting it into practice. So you mentioned the DMV, right? So you're absolutely right. Would not even try and touch magnetism with a 10-foot pole while at the DMV. Most people have smartphones. Most people have devices that they carry around with them to places that perhaps they should not be carried around, right? Bathroom, I'm looking at you. Yeah. But you can have, right, that outline pulled up on your phone, have it easily accessible, right? And then just kind of, okay, I know what I'm working through. I'm looking through this chunk. If there's a term that I don't actually remember that I can make an example for, I'll table that for when I, can sit down and work on it a little bit more. But the other stuff while I'm in line at the grocery store, while, you're maybe not as much these days. So barring technical difficulties, exactly on the phone. So like we were saying, at the DMV, right, you're not going to sit down and try and learn magnetism. You're not going to sit down and pull out a textbook, but basically everyone has access to a smartphone. We take these devices to places that perhaps we should not take them to, such as the restroom, for example. But you can have the outline pulled up on your phone and you can go through examples for the topics that you are a little bit more comfortable with, can knock those out. And then for topics that you're not super sure what type of example to make for, you can table those for the future. And so you don't have to necessarily do everything all at once, but it allows for some of that flexibility. Something else with the psych-soc section that to just kind of keep in mind, aside from the flexibility and the examples, is also it's a section that comes at the very end, right? You have worked through very tedious, very long sections that can be very draining, chem phys, cars, biochem, right? And so a lot of times students will also barrel through the psych-soc section and not give themselves the time that they really need to answer all of the questions.
They just want to be done.
Exactly.
Just like, let me out of here.
Yeah. And so it becomes really important to have just solid examples for that reason, because a lot of times our minds go on autopilot, and this is not a time where you want your mind to go on autopilot, despite the fact that it is a 7.5-hour exam and you're tired. So just something to keep in mind, right? To maintain that stamina throughout the entire exam, this can be a useful strategy as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things related to that. First off, the idea of, it's a long exam, psych-soc at the end. A lot of students struggle with psych-soc, not because it's a psych-soc problem, but because of a stamina problem, where a lot of students are just fatigued and burnt out, and they have trouble thinking because you're just tired and done, especially on the very first couple of exams that you do. But the more exams you do, the better that should get over time. And if you need to work on stamina and endurance, you can do some exercises to do that, right? To take some time to do mini exams and lots. Don't study 30 minutes, a couple of times a day, a couple of days a week, but try to consolidate your studying into big chunks to help you work on that stamina. Behind the scenes, unintentionally, I'm not studying stamina, but I'm building it up because of the way that I'm studying. And that's something to be aware of. The other thing, I know that we talked about this a little bit in one of our previous podcasts, but I would be careful with psych-soc practice materials from different companies. As somebody who was working in the industry when the new MCAT came out in 2015, we all wanted to pump out a psych-soc guide or questions and that sort of stuff, but none of us really understood the psych-soc section. And so a lot of times I'm looking at practice materials from different companies and I see a question the MCAT would never ask that. But the writers didn't know it at the time because the writers were they're adding psych-soc to the MCAT. We have to have some psychology questions. And so let's hire some people who are psychologists to write questions on these topics. But the MCAT would never ask a question that way. And so that is something that is pretty tricky. I actually think that the newer practice materials are better. As is always the case, the AAMC is the gold standard because they're the ones who write the actual exam. That's why we build our course around that. But with our psych-soc stuff, we put out psych-soc, but we started writing those 5 years after the MCAT has changed. And so we understand how psych-soc is tested on the exam, which when I was working at a test prep company, when they added psych-soc, we didn't. And we need to have psychology questions. They say we need to know about Freud. So here's some stuff about Freud, but they're never going to ask that level of question. They're never going to ask what are the diagnostic criteria for dysthymia? But I've seen a question on that. And that's not even though dysthymia, which is a mild depression, is something that the MCAT would expect you to know about, they won't expect you to know the diagnostic criteria or treatments, right? That's not what the MCAT's going to test you. And so I would be careful with your practice sources with that, especially psych-soc compared to any other section, because it was written because a lot of stuff was written before people understood psych-soc, which is why I say I am way better at teaching it now than I was 4 or 5 years ago, because the more you see of something, the more you understand it. And I think at this point, got a good grasp on psych-soc, which is why my students are killing it in the psych-soc section, which is a tongue twister in and of itself.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that we've touched base on today, right? And if you get nothing else out of all of what we've talked about today, put in some more effort into psych soc, come up with examples, come up with stories. There's so much that can be done with this section, and it just really doesn't get enough love. So Phil, you'll have to tell me when your next trial session for psych soc is so I can hop in. Maybe some of our listeners can go ahead and hop into that trial session, give psych a little bit more love, and then work on getting their cumulative score up, and not just the chem phys, not just the cars, not just the biochem.
Yeah. One thing I actually think this might be kind of useful for us to do on the podcast, as we're kind of rounding around the corner of reviewing some very fundamental things. Now we're kind of like breaking down the different sections. We've done chem phys, bio, psych soc. We only have cars left, which you can probably guess what our next session is probably going to be about, the next podcast. But after that, a part of me wants to spend some time just kind of looking at psych soc, like hitting the highlights from the outline of the things that students are most confused by, and like diving into those and discussing those kind of on the podcast. So listeners to the podcast can start to get some like really like content driven stuff to help them with test day in a way that's really high yield, because as you guys all know by now, psych is high yield. So if that's what you guys want to see, go ahead and throw that in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. And if there's something else you would like to see more, then let us know there as well. But I'm actually looking forward to seeing some comments and feedback on this.
And as always, if you're listening to us on Spotify, follow for updates. If you're following us on YouTube, like the video, comment, like Phil said, and then subscribe so you can get the notification when our next podcast is out. Looking forward to seeing you guys next time.